All right, let's begin then. Hopefully, anyone who wants to join will be joining. So, just to give you guys a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing for today, since we've already covered API calls and Axios hooks and use effect, use state, we've covered components, we've covered props. What we can do today is two things. One, we're going to talk a bit about Redux and what the concept of Redux is, why it's used. And secondly, we're going to talk a bit about the MVC architecture and talk about a bit about advanced React coding, which is assuming that now you now know how to code in basic React. How do you implement things in such a way that they conform to industry practice? And so this is actually what's going to land you a job in the future. Because as developers, there are thousands of people who can code, but the amount of people who can code with proper coding rules, with clean code, with organized code is very, very little. The percentage is very small. So we're going to be talking about that today. So for this case, I'll actually show you an example project of my own that I've been working on recently. So you can take inspiration from that. So just let me know if my screen is visible to you guys. I'm just gonna share it. Give me 1 second. Okay, admit. All right. So hopefully my screen is visible to all of you. And what I'm going to do now is, okay, this is the one. Okay, and so this is the project that I'm going to be showing you guys for today. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things, including folder structure, how it's organized and stuff. So, so yeah. So the first thing I want you guys to start off with is understanding how you organize things when you have larger projects. So in this specific project, this project is about a carpooling app, a web carpooling app. So you have the flow is basically related to a user who might want to join a ride, or you might want to create a ride. So there's going to be a person who creates them, and there are people who want to join them. There are going to be different screens for each person. They're going to have requests for each ride, and they're going to be accepting the rides. It's still a work in progress, but a good chunk of it is done. And so here are the conventions that people normally use when you have something like this. All right. So the first thing you have is generally you want to have a constants folder, right? What is this constants folder for in React when you're going to be doing things? There are going to be a lot of things that are going to be required to use in a lot of different places. An example of this is URLs. Let me take you to any screens where URLs are used. For example, you have the screen, right? Now in this screen, you will notice that there's a rides URL being used. This URL is basically the API URL for going to a specific ride, right? So to go to any ride, you enter just rides URL. And the reason you don't actually just use, the question may arise, why don't we actually use the URL itself and just type it down instead of using a variable? And the reason for that is whenever you have any change in the code and you have it in multiple places, if you don't use a constant variable for it, having all the values linked to that constants file, you're going to actually individually have to make changes to every single file to alter the value. And in the long run, it just becomes very, very unsustainable. So, for example, currently in my project, we have, just give me 1 second. Okay, so currently in my project, we have about how many files? Let's say about 10 and 14, 15, 16, about 30, 35, 40, about 40 to 45 files, right? And or maybe about 50, 60 total, right? And if you include the like other con files. And so the point is a lot of these files, a very big chunk of them, are going to be using the same URL because they're all going to be making API requests from the same endpoints, right? Because you always want to make server requests and the server will be in a specific URL, and that URL can move from time to time. So if you don't use a constants file, what's going to end up happening is you're going to make one change to the server URL, and it might be a very small change. Maybe you added slash API instead of the default server. And what it's going to do is you're going to then have to you will end up having errors on all of your screens that you would have to manually fix for each screen. If you have a constants file, all you need to do is you have to go to the constants file, change the specific value of the constant, and all of the values will update accordingly. And a very good example of this, if I just show it to you in real time, is if you go to the right constants, and you can see over here the server URL. Now, the server URL is actually a server that's hosted online, right, on Vercel. Now, imagine that you wanted to change something about this, you can just change it directly. Like for example, Vercel, let's remove Vercel, right? You just press Command S, and it's saved, it's compiled, and everything is saved simultaneously, right? If that wasn't the case, you would be doing it individually. So that's what constants are used for. The next thing we're going to be talking about, and you generally want to place all your constant in one file. As you can see, my file has all of these constants, so you can check all of these values. Your routes are generally going to be placed in your constants. Your anything that doesn't change over time, you want to place it in a constant. So including form names and stuff like that, you just want to keep them in a constants file, right? Now let's talk a bit about how we want to organize files. So in React generally, let's just talk about the basic components for a file structure that you might have, things regarding reusability, right? Now keep in mind that I've made about 50 files, so and each file probably is around on average, let's just give it a small average, uh, depending on the right, might have from anywhere ranging from about 50 lines to maybe 200, where 200 is the upper end. And you might think to yourself, well, these are very few lines. And the idea is that as a good React coder, you're not trying to write a lot of code. You're trying to write very simple, very concise, very summarized code that achieves the same functionality as a person writing thousands of lines of code. That's what your objective is going to be. So that's why the whole point of separating it into multiple files, etc., is this, that you segregate things into small chunks, which you can then reuse over and over again. So even from your perspective, your files should not go ideally over 200 to 250 lines maximum. If you're writing 1,000 line screen, that basically means you're writing about 8 to 900 extra lines of things that don't need to be there, things that can be refactored and then reused. So if you spend about a couple of hours just refactoring those 1,000 lines, you can actually extract the logic, extract the UI into the reusable parts, and that's going to cut your code down not by 10-20%, by a magnitude of about 5. So it's going to take you from 1,000 to a 200 line code, right? And in React, that's exactly what your objective should be. It should be reusing things in such a way that you cut down code. So your screen stopped showing. Sorry, that probably automatically happened. All right. So yeah, so that's what you would want to have as a good React developer. A very good example of this is if you look at my screens. In a lot of the screens, for example, in the driver schedule rides, you have this thing called uh, my progress indicator, right? Now, if you go to this file, this my progress indicator is a very small file. It just is a progress indicator that's literally just it's just a box containing a circular progress that rotates whenever you're waiting for an API to load. It's very simple. It's very small, and you might think to yourself, what's the point of placing it in a separate file when you can just literally copy this code and paste it over here back to this file? And well, the solution is very simple. It's consistency. If you copy the code of this and you paste it in this file, not only is it going to confuse any new developer that comes, but also, like for example, if I were to paste this over here, sorry, it's not correct. Let's copy this. If you, for example, paste this over here, one of the biggest problems you'll have is that you allow every individual who has access to the file to be able to change this screen specifically, which is the last thing you want in React, right? React is dependent upon consistency across screens. You want to have well, not React, but generally coding in general, you want consistency across screens. So if you allow something like this and you forget sometime, which is obviously going to happen if you have lots of components, and from 6 em, which is a way of measuring distance, you change it to 4. There's going to be a slight difference in the UI, in which one of these is going to have 4, one of these is going to have 6. And then it's going to look bad firstly, but also if in the whole UI you want to replace your circular progress indicator with, for example, and want to change the color of the circular progress indicator, you would have to go across each file and make the manual change yourself. Which is why when you extract from the components, which is what I did, all you have to do to change the progress indicator across all of your files is just go back to the component itself and add a change in its label. So instead of justify content center, if you do justify content start, right, it's going to justify the content to the start, right, etc. So it's going to shift the whole circular indicator from the center to the left for all of the files. And this is the whole point of what this is doing. As a CS concept, this is called encapsulation. You encapsulated your entire code for any one specific thing within a specific file. So this is a practical implementation of that. Since this file does not actually need to create the UI for every individual thing, it's only using components from other files. It doesn't need to know what the my progress indicator is. It doesn't need to know where it is. You just need to be able to use it. So we encapsulate this whole thing within its own separate component, which allows you to modify it very easily. That's one thing. All right. So currently keep in mind the topic we're talking about right now is reusability. You know how in React you can reuse things instead of writing longer pieces of code. So that's what we talked about. So this was to do with components, right? Not defined. Oh, sorry. That is identifier for the default export. I don't know. It's probably so. Anyways, so that's what we okay. So we talked about separating it in separate files, and just for those of you who don't know, the way to use separate React component is you create a function with a component name, and just this normal way you make a function, except you capitalize the first letter. So when you capitalize it, it tells React this function is not a normal function; it's a React function, and what that means is it's going to have a return function. So it's over here. This return function. This is necessary, and then you need to export that default function. So even though your JavaScript is going to tell you this is a component, React actually understands that it's not just a component, not just a function. Well, it is actually a function, but it's a function that returns an entire component that you can then use in React. And all React components have to be capitalized. So if you made this driver add right with a small d, somewhere along the lines, it's actually going to give you an error because React needs for the file names to be capital. Right. So we've done covered that. Let's talk a bit about wrapper classes. We just talked about components, and just to have a visualization of what the difference between a child component and a wrapper component is. A child component is something that you can use within any parent component, and it's going to intuitively be added as a child to that. So, for example, if you had a whole page, and within that page you added a component of a navigation bar, that navigation bar is a child component because it actually sits inside the page. The page does not sit inside the navigation bar. There's a very clear hierarchy of parent to child. Now, while that's very useful, there are a lot of times when you actually want components where you are sitting within the component itself. So for example, if you have a screen where you have a whole screen and just a single component where you have, let's say, a list of something, and you want to place that list within a background which is very specific, right? So one way to do that is to manually add that background to that file, add the styling, etc., etc. But the correct way to do that is you actually create a wrapper object, and within that wrapper object, what you want to do is you want to put this props called children. Right? This is a prop of
Ibrahim, your
React.
screen is invisible.
My screen is invisible. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Um, Yeah, if you guys have any questions, please do ask me. Because the whole point of this is to teach this to you guys where you might be at a stage where you're confused, and I expect you all to be confused. So don't be afraid of asking questions. That's the whole point of me being here. If you have questions and you attend this session without resolving them, that's a failure from my end. So you really want to stop me at each stage, and don't feel dumb, right? We've all been at this stage where we don't know anything. I was at a stage where I didn't know any of these things, and I learned them over time because of observing and learning from seniors and doing online courses and stuff like that. So this is just going to help you in the long run, right? React is a very well paid framework. If you understand React, it pays pretty well. So it's something that you have potential for, right? Like if you understand it, it's going to generate income for you. So you don't want to let go of this opportunity to speed up your progress for this thing. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. Yeah. So someone was unmuting their mic, I think. Do you have any question?
Yeah, I actually have a question. I want to
Sure.
know in what sort of projects can you use class-based components instead of functional-based components?
Look. The thing, Hassan, is that there's actually not a very clear distinction anymore. The thing was, before functional components did not exist. Before they didn't exist. Uh, so um, so class components were the norm, right?
Oh,
So there was no use effect, there was no use state. You would just set a state from the class components. However, now since React is upgraded, it's actually almost shifting purely to functional components. And now, actually, if you look at all of the different application stuff, most of them purely use functional components.
right.
Um, so yeah, that's
I was recently asked in an interview question about React. So the questions were about class-based components. So I've never worked with them. So it kind of boggled
I
me
see.
like, is there something new about React now?
I see. That's good to hear that you're giving interviews. But yeah, but with these cases, you can always say, right, okay, that the latest updates have now made the class-based components obsolete. So requiring knowledge of them doesn't make any sense, because class-based components is the exact same thing as function components with just more boilerplate code. So instead of, for example, over here, for example, you have function foreground children title. You see how easy it was to add these props with
Yeah.
class-based components. It's going to be significantly harder, because you're going to have to set a state, and you're going to have to be like this dot state dot child is this, and you're going to have the code just becomes a lot longer. So just writing a single file can take you a lot longer instead of functional component where you start. So yeah,
Right.
it's a very good question. And I would encourage you all to ask similar questions, because they clear confusions and they're going to aid you in your future interviews. Don't we use Camucase in JS? So why does React components need? That's a very good question. Is why do we use um, in caps? Why do you use caps for this? And the main reason for this is that it's to differentiate React from HTML. So for example, if you go to JSX, if you go to any JSX, I'm sure you guys have know about this. I've mentioned this before. But before, for example, you had HTML, where somebody joined. Before, where you had HTML, you could use tags like this, like you have div tag, and this div tag contains a paragraph tab, etc. This is what an HTML file would traditionally look like, right? You have the same concept, you have hierarchies, etc. When React came in, it said, okay, we're going to be doing the same thing, except we're going to make it dynamic. So now you have, like, for example, React header or something like that, and it's going to be like React something else, React something. And people very quickly realized that you need a way to differentiate that this component is a traditional HTML component and this component is a React component. And the way they did that was very easily done by capitalization. So any component that is capitalized automatically tells the renderer, okay, this is not your standard HTML tag, because you're not just going to be using these functions as functions. You're actually using them as components within almost like an HTML type syntax. This is called JSX, right? JSX to define it is this is normally called HTML, right? But HTML is static, which means that you actually write it down and you can then use it. People said, okay, how about we made it so that you can return HTML? So that's where JSX come in. So now JSX would allow you to do expressions things like return this, and it's going to be like div. Sorry, it's going to be div. So this looks like almost the exact same as HTML, but there's a very huge difference, because this is not HTML. This is not HTML. This is JSX. JSX is it's basically JavaScript uh, version of HTML. It takes HTML and returns it as an object. So you can actually manipulate it. So it's not just like a constant thing, it's a returned object, which is very different from this, which is pure HTML and can work with CSS. So when JSX came along and you started using React components, you wanted to be able to differentiate very easily because this is the React component. And so that's where capitalization came in, and that's why it's necessary, even though most components would use camel casing. So that's the reason. So yeah, and this is a general note. The whole point of casings and things like that is to organize and give structure to things. So all of these conventions were created for a reason, right? So even camel casing was there for consistency. So whenever something comes in, there's always a reason for it if you have the capacity to research for it, right? If you look deep enough. So yeah, that's basically it. Um, so we're going to move on to we did foreground. We just covered foreground, and if we've covered components, we've covered functions. Um, yeah, and just for Hassan, because Hassan asked about what's the difference between functions and this is like if you have a look at this, there's these things called use effect within this, right? Use effect is going to be functional hook for and use state and use select, just things like that. So this is use state. This basically says, okay, store this store this constant within this React component. So in a React function, not a React component, but we call them components. They're called functional components versus class-based components. So a functional component would use this syntax for storing a variable, and a class-based component would actually do this dot state is equals to and etc. For example, form data, etc. is going to be a default. So it's the exact same thing. You say it's like almost the exact same thing, but it's just a different syntax. And accessing this is slightly more complex. Instead of doing form data directly, you'd want to do this dot state dot form data. So right, all of you guys who want to be giving interviews out there, that's basically what it does. All right. And for example, for things like when you add components, you're going to be loading the component, you're going to be unloading the component. So you don't have use effect. You had on component load or something like that. I forgot what the exact syntax is. Which basically means when the component is loaded, you call this function, and then you add on component something unload something like that, and you would basically call this whenever the component is deleted, right, from the directory from the DOM. The thing is, you no longer need these things because now you have use effect, and use effect basically is, let me show you guys. Use effect basically does the exact same thing. It's over here. Let me just turn off this error lens for a second so you guys can see more clearly. I think it's confusing you guys. Extensions. So you have error lens. Reload. Okay. Okay. So, for example, you have this thing called use effect, first return, second, third, etc. This thing took the entire thing for components, for class-based components, and basically just made very, very small. This is doing the exact same thing. It's saying if when the component is loaded, do the first thing. When the component is unloaded, do the second thing. And whenever this third thing is changed, you run this whole thing again. So this, for example, this could be a variable like data. Whenever your data is changed, run the effect again. So it's a very handy way of doing the exact same thing as a classic component, just faster. Okay, so you might want to remember that for interview questions. Compare. Okay. Don't save it. Okay. Now you've done that, and if you look, let's see what else is there. Let's just delete this. I don't know what this is here. Okay, so you've talked about that. Let's talk a bit. Yeah, okay. So generally in React, you're going to have a couple of major things when it comes to React. You're going to have the main thing is you're going to global components. This is going to be the bunch of components that you're going to be using over and over again. Keep in mind when you have a component in React, even though we call it a component, what we refer to it is basically a UI element. So for example, if you say global components, you're basically saying a lot of UI elements that are going to be used in places. So for example, this app bar, etc., has this function, etc. So it's got this entire function, it's got all these things, etc., etc. This is a global component that's going to be used in whenever you want to have an app bar. Keep in mind, this app bar should only contain the UI. It should not contain the logic. The logic should be somewhere else. So this is a part of what MVC is. You can do this. There's nothing wrong. React will not throw you errors, but it removes the possibility of reusing the same component for different things. Just to give you an example of what I mean, we have this component called my material table, and my material table is a component that allows you to do things like data fetching and displaying data within a table. It's very very useful. You're going to be using this a lot when you're in companies. It's a component of Material GUI, which is a UI library. It's very commonly used. It's a lot of functionality. Right. But the thing is, you don't want to add any logic to this component, any state to this component, because what it'll do is it'll add that logic and state to every container, every screen that ever uses this component. So always remember, when you're using a component, keep the logic separate from the UI. Keep the logic separate from the UI. And you might be thinking, okay, what does this mean? What does Ibrahim mean when he says keep the logic separate from the UI? So you can see on this page, we have this thing called a handle change page. And it's basically a props that is passed from this material table. You're saying that the parent will pass this handle change page, and it's just going to handle it. So the on change page event, right? And you might be thinking, okay, well, you could have just written the handler within the specific code, and then you could use the logic everywhere else. But you have to understand the logic will actually be different for different components. So one component might have a want to handle the change differently compared to another component. Later on down the line, when you have these kind of situations, you won't be able to reuse that component. It's going to become useless for you. So you have to separate the logic from the UI. It's very, very important. Do not put change handlers within global components. Do not put on add, data fetching, functionality, stuff like that within a global component. It's there purely for the UI.
Could you show how to do that with an example? Like how do you export that function into the component then?
How do we export that function into a component?
Yeah.
Uh, sure, sure. I'll show you how to do that. So, for example, if you have, how do you export? Sorry, could you repeat that? How do you export what to
Yeah,
what?
let's say like you just talked about a handle change, right? One example I can think
Yeah,
of is like how you would use a sidebar function like when you're on a mobile screen or trying to make it responsive, right? So you'd
yeah,
have that handle change to be true or false depending on the screen size or depending on if the user clicks it, right?
yeah, yeah.
So I would normally
Okay,
just create a use state for that on inside the React component. So if we
okay.
have
I'll
to
show you.
export, yeah, right.
I'll show you. Good question. It's a good question. So I'll go to a place where this table is used, and you can see over here that this is using my material table. Let me show you. It's using my material table over here. So this was the child component that you had, and you're like, okay, how can we use it somewhere else? So I'm using this right over here, and you can see over here that my material table is actually being used as a child component. Let me separate that. And within it, you're passing in the props that you want to be dynamic. So I haven't added all the props right now, but you can see that the data is being passed over here as data instead of it being directly over there. So you pass the data from the parent to the child, and then the child made use of it. And you pass the columns from the parent to the child, and the child made use of it. And you pass the delete. So you pass the delete handler. And now that you were asking, right? So in this delete handler, I haven't done anything because I'm going to add things. But normally, what you would do is you would say on handle delete, you would want to call it make API call. Like I'll just give you an example. So just actually access, I'll actually have a delete call, delete one. This is actually an API call that I've implemented. And I'm just going to pass the ID to this call, and it's going to, I want to return let's just log the results. So it's gonna do this, and it's gonna log the results. And so now you've seen that we use this material table within different component, within a different parent component. This is actually a screen, right? So you can see it's a passenger table screen. And screens are different from child components. Well, I just talk a bit about terminology here. We talk about components a lot, but generally, when you go in the industry, there are going to be two main words you use when it comes to React. There is going to be components, and there's going to be containers. Then there's going to be, so these are your primary two React objects. What's the difference? Components are going to be children. They're basically UI elements that you're going to be having consistently across certain different screens. So in our case, you had a my material table in which the table was the same across different screens. Only the elements to the table that were being passed, only the data that was being passed to the table was different. So that table itself becomes a UI component, which we call my material table. Now, when you're going to be using that UI component, you'd want to apply logic to it. As you can see, this is the logic that you apply to the component. So this is basically called a container. A container. So you've got component, which is the UI. Then you've got container, which is a parent of the UI, which is the parent of the UI. You can see the UI over here, and this whole thing is a parent, and it passed the relevant information and logic to the child. So you see how this is very interesting. Is that all this did? This whole function, if you look at it from the start to end, it's very very small. All it did was it passed data and it passed the functionality and logic to the child. That's all it did. So you separated logic from functionality, and this is very very useful in the long run, because when you start ending up, when you start having errors, your code is not going to say error at this UI element, etc., etc. It's going to specifically say within the logic there was this function within this passenger table screen that was not working. Understand? If you took this handle delete function, you took all these logics and you put them in child table, error tracing is going to be very very difficult. But now it becomes very simplified because all the logic is passed from the parent component, uh, or container, right? So just write it down. Component, UI, sorry, it's a UI, and it's a child, right? I'm just describing for you guys. It's not code, and it's reusable, right? That's a React component. And when you talk about a container, it's going to be more like to do with logic, and it's going to contain child components, contain UI components, and it's not defined to be. It's not supposed to be very reusable. Not very reusable, right? Ideally speaking, it can be reusable actually, but like it's you're not going to be actually just using this everywhere, because the whole point of having a container is that you define some logic to your UI. So this is just an example of how you can actually practically implement this thing that I was talking to you guys about in a usable function, right? And you can see over here, just as a recap, this is a child, this is the different things that you were talking about, the functionality, and this is the implementation of that functionality. So implementation goes in the parent, UI is within the child. You're passing the implementation onto the child via props. And I think a lot of you might be confused. You might be thinking, okay, how do you handle the delete function from the parent? And the answer to that is in JavaScript, you can actually pass handlers to the child. So normally in JS, what you would do is, normally in Java, what you guys would be doing is you would be passing. You would think, okay, you should pass the function as a function, right? Which is handle delete as a function. So take the output and return it. But we're not actually doing that. We're actually saying that send the entire function as an object to the child. So the child isn't actually this when you go to the child, it's not actually getting the output of handle delete. You might think, oh, it's getting the output of passengers, it's getting the output of passenger columns. But in the case of the function, it doesn't actually get the output of handle delete. It doesn't get handle delete output, which in this case is going to be जो भी आप in this case it's going to be आपकी API call का output, API call output. You might be thinking that this is what we're passing to the child, but no, that's not the case. You're not passing any return thing to the child. You're actually passing the whole function as an object in itself. So you're literally saying कि पूरे इस function को लो, इस पूरी चीज को लो और child को भेज दो. So the child actually knows. The child actually knows कि जो मुझे prop आया है ना, जब इसको मैंने actually runs the code, उसको जो ये prop है ना, उसको actually मिल जाएगा. मतलब जिस तरह for example इनका on delete function हो गया था, on delete. The child actually on its all delete function, the child will actually run the parent function. So if for example if your code arrives here, your child will not just run on delete, it's actually going to run on delete, delete. It's going to run API, make API call, and then log it, console.log. The child is actually going to run the whole thing over here. So this is a very beautiful part of JavaScript actually, is that you can actually use functions in somewhere else, and it allows you to use them separate from where they're defined. So it's a very complex concept. You're probably going to get confused the first time you see it, but it's very, very useful. And this is the exact reason why your logic can be differentiated from the UI, because you're not only passing the returned object, you're actually passing the entire function as a parameter to the child component. Okay, so that's basically it for child versus container, and we're going to talk about some of the things. Okay, it's an actual project I'm working on, so I have to ensure that I'm not actually messing it up. All right, so we talked about child versus container components. Okay, let's talk a bit about naming. So with naming, generally you want to make it so that whenever you make a folder name for a React folder that contains React files, you generally want to capitalize that, because it tells you basically that I have components with that folder name. So the backend admin basically tells you that I have components, excuse me, with that folder name. So that's just something you want to remember instead of having to fight over, okay, small or large. All right. Another thing we want to talk about is the fact how you could separate logic. We've actually now come into a stage where now even components and containers are not the norm now. There's this new norm that's coming in, which is called hooks. So before it used to be like आपकी जो आपकी UI होती थी ना, it was going to be within um, containers. Sorry, UI is going to be within components, right? So it's going to usually global components now. That's okay. Global components. And your logic would basically be within containers, and these would basically contain the child, contain multiple components. Okay, this is basically the overall design. And when you are implementing a screen, you would generally use a combination of containers. So for example, if you had a screen, your screen would according to best practices just look like a bunch of containers that you've used. So container, and then container, you know, container one, container two, and then maybe component one. This is what your screen would look like. So your screen should not have looked like all this logic, etc., 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 and then some UI, etc., etc. Your screen should not look like that. It should just be like an index of components and containers that you can reuse. Now that's changing slightly, because the whole point of a container used to be logic. So now you find a way to, now the new update has been that your logic can actually be extracted from the containers themselves into separate hooks. And this is a very modern thing, and you should, if you know this, people are going to be very, very impressed, because it got introduced pretty recently and it's been coming into use very slowly. And I'll show you a very beautiful example of it. So for example, just to go into function, we had this function called passenger table, right, which is basically a table of passengers, sorry, a React component, right? And the interesting thing was this table needed to remember what the data within its table was, right? So the problem was, normally you'd want to use something like a use state for, and with whatever data you have, and label that data, etc., right? And then based on that data, you can use that data whenever you want. And then if you have any logic, you'd do the API call over here. So you'd have a const API call, etc. Let's just say get API call. Let's just say get passenger, right, etc., etc. It's going to take a payload, and based on the payload, it's going to return an output. Okay. This, you'd have to normally actually implement this within the passenger table, but you'll realize over time that this actually gets redundant, because all the screens are going to have very similar things. You're going to have very similar things in another file as well. They're also going to have data. They're also going to have a get call. The get call is also going to take a payload. It's also going to return output. So the only thing that's actually changing is what you're getting. The whole logic is the same. So wouldn't it be amazing, instead of writing this out in every single file, you could write this in a single file and could remember the state and the logic. So this is where hooks come into play. And hooks are a very beautiful concept. And this is it, they took this entire functionality and put in this one line. So in this one line, they said, okay, use get data, the passenger URL, basically telling you, okay, get the data for the passenger, not for someone else, and save the data as the passengers, and give me an is loading icon. telling me that the data is loading. And the entire logic, the entire state has now been managed within these 1 2 lines. So, and this is in the long term, you're going to realize these things are so useful, because ये use get data function है, ये थोड़ा बहुत complex है. इसके आप देखो shady बनाई हुई है, आपने use effect डाला हुआ है. तो use effect is basically going to load things whenever you need to. आपकी x axis get call भी है, आपका set data भी है, आपका is loading वगैरह भी है, जो भी है. It's managing all these things separately. अलग से इसने सारी लॉजिक ले ली, और अब आपको एक नया कंपोनेंट बनाना है ना, और आपको लॉजिक इंप्लीमेंट करनी है. इट्स बिकम सो ईजी. अपने पास एक नया कंपोनेंट बनाएंगे. फॉर एग्जांपल दिस पेज इज एम्प्टी. You just make a function, right? Let's just say passenger table, right? Passenger. Let's just call it driver table for now. Driver table. And you're going to, in this function, you want to return something that's return the material table, right? So we're going to return the material table. My material table. So my material table, and within this material table you're going to just pass the props. So data is equals to etc. Data is equals to data, and you need the data, right? So where do you get the data from? And to implement this whole logic that you need to do, you just do one thing, just literally one line. You just say const whatever data I need, data, whatever I'm going to save the data as, you can just call it data if you want to. Is loading indicator. You can even exclude that if you want to, and you can just say use get data, and you can pass in where do you want to get the data from. So previously I wanted to get from the passenger's URL, but now I want to get from the driver's URL, and so I would just say driver's URL. And the amazing thing is, you will now actually create a whole page. This is actually a whole page that you successfully created within about, let's say, 10-20 seconds, that actually has a table, that it's actually doing data fetching, that's actually remembering the data, it's remembering the state, it's giving you is loading icon. You can get the is loading icon from over here. You can display that data. All of that was done within a matter of seconds, because you separated the logic into a separate component. So this is just one of those beautiful things that you guys really want to know. It's really going to help you. It's going to make things easier for you in the long run. So yeah, that's just separating the new way to separate logic, right? Which is hooks. So then where will we implement the logic for the components? Oh, sorry, Bilal. I'm sorry, I didn't see your question. I was on the other screen. Then we will implement the logic for the components. I think I answered this question though. Didn't I answer it like over here where we have the handlers, etc.?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Bilal, do you still have this query? Do you still have this confusion? Hello,
Uh,
Bilal. Oh, it's clear now. Okay, okay, it's all good then. All right, thank you. Okay, so we've covered logic. This logic is very important. Make sure you guys start using it. It's going to look very good in your resume, in your CV. So yeah, remember that. Okay, and another very beautiful thing you can do is you can actually apply the same thing to handle functions. So for example, you have handle delete over here. You can actually separate the logic and just call it a handle change util, or a handle change function, or a general handle change function. And then you can actually say that आप जो भी handler हो ना, उसकी आप event लो, which is basically कि change हो अभी, उसका data लो, कि मतलब कौन से कहाँ पे वो डेटा उस चीज़ का स्टोर हो रहा था. तो मिसाल के तौर पे अगर आपको एक फॉर्म है, उसके नाम बंदे का नाम स्टोर कर रहे हैं, तो डेटा के अंदर इस बंदे का नाम आएगा, और सेट डेटा इस बंदे के अंदर वो दिस इज गोइंग टू टेक द सेट फंक्शन फॉर दैट नेम. This basically getter, this is basically setter, this is basically the event of when that happens. So when this is basically saying, okay, this is going to take an event that's going to be triggered when the name field changes. Then it's going to take the name variable that's storing that name. It's going to set that variable to whatever you want, and it's going to apply this to every single handle you want. So instead of going, so let me just show you somewhere where it's implemented. Instead of going, yeah, this is a wonderful place to show how it was implemented. In this, you can see there was, before I actually implemented this logic within this component or container, जो भी आप कहना चाहो. So yeah, or I had to implement this handle change logic within every single जगह जहाँ पर भी implement कर रहा हूँ. जब मैंने util use किया ना, आपकी सारे code खत्म हो गया. You just have to have one line. You're going to call this component, done, right? So now, and it's reusable across files. You literally have to make one single handle change event, and it's going to be able to handle everything. You can put that same handle change in all of the objects, and it's automatically going to save it according to whatever it is. So make को save कर देगा, model को save कर देगा, ये को save कर देगा, all of that. It's a beautiful thing. So I would say इस चीज़ को भी master कर दो. You know, how do you separate logic? How do you make it reusable? You know, if you didn't take the event and you didn't take the data and you didn't take the set data, it wouldn't be reusable. But because you've taken the things that are common and made the things that are uncommon only used in that specific component, you can take the whole logic and separate somewhere else. तो आपके long term के अंदर बड़ा फायदा होगा, आपके components बहुत छोटे बन जाएंगे. सही है. Let's not talk about models right now. These are just examples of the use hooks. So the use get data hooks like this, and a bunch of other hooks, which actually contain. Keep in mind your hooks actually. The beautiful thing about hooks is they actually store the state and the use effect within themselves. So it's almost like their own functional React components, but they're not actually components. They're just logic. They just took the logical part of your React component and said, okay, I'm just going to keep the logic, no UI. So this should not return UI. It's only for the logic. Keep that in mind. सो आपने यूआई को भी सेपरेट कर दिया, आपने लॉजिक भी सेपरेट कर दिया, तो आपका एक ब्यूटीफुल एक स्ट्रक्चर बन गया जिसके आपकी लॉजिक सेपरेट है, यूआई सेपरेट है. ठीक है. And this is actually this third thing is called model. We won't probably go into that today. It's pretty complex. Model is basically to do with data fetching, with the database itself. So instead of the API calls, you also have models for the objects themselves. मिसाल के तौर पे आपके rides model होगा, it's going to say कि how your ride is going to look like. And it's pretty complex, so I won't go into detail today. But basically, जब आपका एक ride object होगा ना database के अंदर, उसका उस ride object के corresponding model होगा. The model is basically going to a schema, a structure for what that looks like in the database. So this tells me that this is a ride ID, it has a number. So generally, using React, and you want to make a new page, you generally have these three components. Sorry, not I shouldn't use the word components. These three primary key things that are going to be used in every single React screen you have, and that's model, view, and container. And let me just write that down: model, view, container. Sorry, container. Okay. And the model is basically, and this whole structure, the whole part of the structure is basically, oh, sorry, model view. Let me see. Model view, container, right? Yeah, container. Yeah, controller. Sorry, model view controller. Okay, model view controller. And this is actually a very popular architecture. It's applied in coding now everywhere in the world. And basically, what this architecture basically says is, आपके जो पेज होगा ना उसके थ्री पार्ट्स होंगे. पहला पार्ट होगा उसका जो है जो डेटाबेस फेचिंग, ठीक है. डेटाबेस से आपका जो ताल्लुक होगा ना, जो भी आपके डेटाबेस से ताल्लुक होगा ना, आपने डेटाबेस के पार्ट में डाल देना. फिर उसका सेकंड पार्ट होगा उसका यूआई, ठीक है, हाउ इट लुक्स, बेसिकली हाउ इट लुक्स, ठीक है, हाउ इट लुक्स लाइक, ठीक है. दिस इज गोइंग टू बी योर यूआई पार्ट. And you'll always have this on the screen. So you've got the database, you've got the UI. The database also includes the API calls. And the third part is going to be the logic. How do you incorporate the data, the logic for the handlers, for getting the data, for using the data? So that's going to be the logic. The logic. It's called actually the business logic. Business logic. And these three things correspond exactly to the model view controller, which is a very popular. This is actually the modern वर्ल्ड का जो पॉपुलर जो अब चल रहा है ना आर्किटेक्चर. दिस इज आर्किटेक्चर. दिस इज अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग. आपके इंटरव्यूज के अंदर प्रॉब्ली पूछेंगे, डू यू नो व्हाट मॉडल व्यू कंट्रोलर इज, एंड आपको पता होना चाहिए कि इट्स बेसिकली अ मॉडर्न आर्किटेक्चर ऑफ कोड in which you can separate code into individual concerns. So instead of writing all of these things in a single file, you separate them into separate files and then use those files whenever you want to. ओके, दिस इज मॉडल व्यू. एंड जो हमने इंप्लीमेंट कर रहे थे ना, बेसिकली इसी चीज़ की फॉर्म है. मिसाल के तौर पे आपकी जो आपकी मॉडल है, जो आपका जो डेटाबेस का इंटरफेस वगैरह, ये सब आपकी मॉडल के अंदर आएगा. जो आपकी चार ग्लोबल कंपोनेंट्स है ना, वो बेसिकली आपके जो है व्यू के अंदर आ जाएंगे. एसेंशियली पार्ट ऑफ योर व्यू, राइट. और जो आप कंट्रोलर है ना, इसके आप बेसिकली हैंडल्स आ जाएंगे, आपके गेटर्स, कॉल्स वगैरह, स्टेट वगैरह जो भी है वो आ जाएगी, राइट. सो आपकी सारी बिजनेस लॉजिक आपके कंट्रोलर में आएगी, आपका मॉडल आपका डेटा फेच करेगा, and बाकी चीज़ें आप लोग समझ गए, right? Just remember this model view controller. If you have any questions about this, please do ask. क्योंकि ये एक बड़ी चीज़ है जो आपको इंटरव्यूज के नाम श्योर पूछी जाएगी. आपकी सारी जो कोडिंग होगी ना मॉडर्न, वो इस तरीके से होती है. No one codes in a single file. हर चीज़ कोड करती. The separate concerns to separate files into separate structures. सही है, ठीक है. तो अगर किसी को सवाल है बता दें, क्योंकि मैं एक आखिरी चीज़ कवर कर रहा हूँ, फिर मैं ख़त्म कर रहा हूँ. I think there's a question here. Um, so no questions? Okay. Alrighty then. So let's just cover the last thing, which is आपने वो cover कर दिया था, model वगैरह cover कर दिया है. Yeah, we just talk a bit about TypeScript. Because I'm next class के अंदर भी मैं TypeScript उधर mention करूँगा. Um, ठीक है. अच्छा, जिस तरह आप you can see कि मैंने API calls वगैरह आपकी इधर Axis की API calls separately place की हुई हैं, और मैंने जो अपना कॉन्स्टेंट्स का फोल्डर सेपरेटली प्लेस किया हुआ है, सही है, कॉन्स्टेंट्स का फोल्डर सेपरेटली प्लेस किया हुआ है, ठीक है, और फिर मैंने अपने जो स्क्रीन है सेपरेट, इवन दिस इज रॉन्ग, जनरली डोंट वांट टू पुट एनी इंडिविजुअल स्क्रीन अलग से, यू वांट टू पुट एपीआई, कॉन्स्टेंट्स, हुक्स, मॉडल, यूटिल्स, और फिर आपको इनकी सब फोल्डर्स में बनाना चाहिए, आपको एक और फोल्डर बनाना चाहिए स्क्रीन्स, और स्क्रीन्स के आपके सारे स्क्रीन्स आने चाहिए, जो मैंने गलत किया, मैंने उसको इम्प्लीमेंट नहीं किया हुआ, लेकिन आइडियली यू वांट स्क्रीन्स, यू गॉट कंपोनेंट्स, ग्लोबल कंपोनेंट्स एंड स्क्रीन्स, और देन जो भी आपकी लॉजिक वगैरह होगी दैट वुड यूजुअली गो इन यूटिल्स, एनी कॉमन लॉजिक, रिडक्स वगैरह आप यूज करें, इट्स गोना गो इन यूटिल्स. So yeah, that's the idea, and yeah, that's basically what it comes to in terms of folder structure. Folder structure is very personal, so it's pretty dependent on choice. You generally want to make it in a way that it's very reusable by कि आपकी जब टीम इस्तेमाल करे उनको intuitively समझ आ जाए, अच्छा इस फोल्डर के अंदर ये चीज़ आएंगी, इस फोल्डर के ये चीज़ आएंगी ऑटोमेटिकली, ठीक है. तो yeah, that's the idea, and what else can I tell you guys about? Hmm. Yeah, that's basically it. That's basically it for today. I'm going to talk about Redux a bit tomorrow and some other stuff. But yeah, MVC की बात हो गई, फोल्डर स्ट्रक्चर की बात हो गई, सेपरेटिंग लॉजिक की बात हो गई, सेपरेटिंग यूआई की बात हो गई. I think we're good to go. तो आप लोगों को कोई सवाल है तो let me know.
I have one. Um, I know how to use prof, like how you can send like data from the parent to the child, but is there a way to send it back, like from child back to the parent? Can that
That's a
work out?
very good question. That's a very very good question, Hassan. और ये एक्चुअली मेरे ख्याल से आप कंट्रीब्यूट में पूछेंगे,
Right.
बिकॉज ये जो ना इट्स वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स, और पेरेंट्स से चाइल्ड में भेजना बड़ा आसान है. क्योंकि म्यूट योर माइक फॉर अ सेकंड यार, आवाज सी खासी आ रही है. थैंक यू. ठीक है, इट्स वेरी गुड क्वेश्चन, and I will show you exactly of a place where that's used. So, material table. So the interesting thing is you cannot, just to answer your question first, you cannot directly do it. So you can't, जिस तरह आप एक पेरेंट के जाके, जिस तरह मैंने पैसेंजर टेबल है ना, इसके पेरेंट के जाके आप डायरेक्टली कह सकते हैं ना कि आप जो है आप मटेरियल टेबल के अंदर डेटा पास कर दो. If you want to get the data from the child, you can't do that. But directly, like, you can't do it directly. You can't just say कि parent के अंदर जाके child data मिसाल के तौर पे मिल जाएगी. नहीं, it won't be done that way, because the way it works is that the React renderer actually renders the parent first and then renders the child. So it can take ऊपर से नीचे दे सकता है. It can like take from the father and give to the child. But how can you take the child's data and give it to the father, right? It's kind of complex. So that's where handlers come in, and that's the beauty of handlers. And so, for example, when we have a material table, when you have an on-delete function, this material table is a child, but it actually returns the row data to the parent. And you will say, okay, how does it return this row data to the parent, right? And the way it does it is very interesting. You actually create a function. A function का आपने बस signature बनाया है. You're just going to call this function on delete row data ID, or this function को you're going to be setting this function as one of the props for the child component. So for example, you can see the on delete function is over here, right? So देखो इस on delete function के नाम एक parameter pass करें row data.id. So what happens is very interestingly, the on delete function is now going to be implemented in the parent, right? The parent के अंदर on delete function की implementation handle delete, because child sends the on delete, parent has the handle delete. What actually happens when you run the code is that the code is going to run here, it's going to run here, it's going to run this on delete, then when it goes to on delete, इसकी implementation थोड़ी है child के अंदर, तो वो actually parent में जाएगा और इसकी implementation में जाएगा, and it's actually going to get the ID from the child and use it within the parent. So जो console.log आएगा ना आपका, वो parent के अंदर आएगा, लेकिन जो data था वो data acquire आपके child से हुआ है. So it's a pretty complex thing, but if you learn how to use this, it's very very powerful. It's very powerful, because it gives you two-way data manipulation, right? So that's basically that's well, there's also another way. This is actually the way you're going to be using most of the time. The other way is that you use Axios, and what Axios does, it basically Axios नहीं, Redux आपका सारी जो state management है ना, वो disconnect कर देता है आपके parent child से. So Redux says parent child सब छोड़ो, there's just a general state, there's a global state, और इस global state के store के अंदर सारी आपकी information सारी global store के अंदर पड़ेगी, राइट. तो जो भी आपको चाइल्ड से कुछ चाहिए होगा ना, आप ग्लोबल स्टोर में डाल दो. पेरेंट्स से आप उठाना है ना, आप ग्लोबल स्टोर में डाल दो. तो मिसाल के तौर पे, इंस्टेड ऑफ द Redux way to do this would be just to, instead of this on edit row data, you would say save row store row data, and it's going to take the ID and it's just going to store it in Redux. And then you're going to go to the parent and you're going to do retrieve raw data, and you're going to go to this Redux store. मैं बहुत simplified बता रहा हूँ, obviously boilerplate code ज़्यादा होगा. And you're going to say give me the ID, and it's going to give you the ID. So that's one of the other ways that you're going to use this, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow. But you only want to use this for data that is used in multiple places. अगर आपको सिर्फ एक child से एक parent कोई चीज़ return करनी है, there's no point of sending it into Redux. Redux only for the things that you want to use a lot, right? So that's just, I hope that answers your question. It's a very good question. And actually आप practically implement करेंगे ना, तो आपको industry के चीज़ें काफ़ी unknown है. For example, where I've been working, they actually didn't implement these things, so I was asking them to implement them. So it's just very useful. But yeah, any other questions? कोई और सवाल हो तो बता दें, वरना मैं मीटिंग को खत्म कर दूंगा, right? हसान या जुहैर, कोई सवाल आता हो? No? All right, so I'm going to assume you guys don't have any questions. Thank you for the session, for attending the session. Hope you guys have a good day.